Okay, well, I'd like to begin by thanking you for the kind introduction, the kind words. Thank you to AITM for inviting me here. I'm having a great time in Kathmandu, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. So for the last couple of years I've been looking at infrastructure planning under climate change, Australia as a country is very much affected by climate change, so is Nepal, and so I'm presenting some ideas about Australia, and I hope they've got some relevance or some interest to some of the problems that you might be thinking about in Nepal. Australia's recently had the worst drought in its history. It's been a catastrophic drought, the worst in 200 years, and there was a fear that the climate had altered permanently towards drier conditions, and the governments around Australia responded to this by building desalination plants to supply urban water to all the capital cities of Australia. At the time these plants were begun, their construction was begun, as I say, we were in the middle of a terrible drought. What happened was that as the projects began to be built, it started to rain. And it rained for about 3 years. Not continuously, but we had very heavy rains for about 3 years. And those projects are now, for the most part, lying idle. They're not being used. This is an example. This is a project in my home state, Victoria. It cost $4 billion US to construct. It's currently idle. It's not being used at all. Because the cost of getting water from this plant exceeds the cost of getting water from dams, which are now full. We've had 3 years of pretty good rain. So to give you an idea of the cost of this plant, the government is obliged to pay $1.8 million per day towards the cost of this plant for 27 years, irrespective of whether the plant is used at all. Nepal's problem, I'm not sure. I've been in Nepal for 4 weeks. I'm not an expert on Nepal's natural resource problems, but perhaps hydropower issues fall into the same kind of category as this project. They're a bit different because these technologies pay off if climate change is not a problem. The desalination projects pay off if climate change is a problem. So it's a slightly different idea, but basically the case for engaging in a program of very large-scale hydropower development in Nepal is a gamble on climate. You're forming expectations about what you think the climate is going to be in the future, and you're making investment decisions on the basis of those expectations. It's very similar to the problem that I'm addressing in an Australian setting. So, what to do in this situation? I'm going to try to sketch a familiar approach to economists, but it might not be familiar to non-economists. One method of approach is to think about using real option analysis to regard this kind of investment in much the same way that you treat a financial option. So here you focus on things like the risks of various types of events. What's the risk of severe climate change? What's the risk of moderate climate change? What are the probabilities associated with these things? What are our prospects for learning about these risks? Will we have a better understanding of climate change in 20 years' time? If we'll have a much better understanding of what's going on in relation to the climate in 20 years, it might make sense to postpone doing things for 20 years. If we're not going to learn in the future about what's happening, then it doesn't make sense to wait. We might as well form estimates of returns now and take a decision now. If we can learn, we've got reasons to think about waiting. And finally, you've got to think about this fact that if you do undertake these projects, for example, this desalination plant in Australia, if it turns out to be uneconomic, there's absolutely no use for that capital. You can't turn it into a hotel or something like that. You're stuck with the desalination. Risk neutrality. So it's hard to get numerical information about when we should proceed, when we should act on these types of projects. Often we don't have data. The approaches are often not operationally implementable. So I can give you a feeling for what's going on here. I can say to you, well, you should be conservative about these projects. But if you say how conservative, I've got to be a bit evasive about that because I don't have good data that will give me a definite feel for how you should proceed here. Sometimes people construct data. I put data here in quote marks because it's not really data, it's a simulation exercise. They try different probability estimates, different estimates of what's going to happen to stream flow, and they run different simulations, and then they come up with different rules for when you should proceed. But this isn't data-based analysis. This is inventing data, and it's not a really good procedure at all. The main thing you get from these procedures are qualitative insights. Insights like be conservative, postpone projects as much as you can. And that information can be useful, but it doesn't give you all the information that you need here. Here are some examples. One example is just to wait. Okay, that's one way you can deal with this problem. You wait and you hope that you get better information. So if you're, say, experiencing a drought, you might wait a while. Hopefully the drought will break. That's what happened in Australia. They built these big projects. As they were constructing them, the rains came. But it was a bit late. They were already involved in constructing the projects. You can overestimate this waiting idea. Sometimes you can leave these projects pretty much to the last minute, so you can pre-plan the projects. For example, you can design the projects in advance. You can buy the land that you're going to use to implement the projects. You can keep a site available to construct a dam. You can perhaps clear the site, have it ready to proceed with a relatively short space of time. You can get environmental approvals. You can plan the construction without necessarily following that with actual construction of the project. But what that does is it reduces the lead time involved in actually implementing the project. That's a very simple thing that you can do that reduces your need to wait. You've got all these things pre-planned. The only thing you've got to do then is to actually proceed with the project. For the case of the desalination plants in Australia, the planning time was about equal to the construction time. So if you can get rid of that planning phase, or if you can pre-plan the whole thing, you can cut the overall time for the project by half. And that again gives you much more flexibility if you're thinking about introducing these sorts of projects. One thing is that policymakers are risk averse. Policymakers don't necessarily want to maximise expected returns. Policymakers are often really averse to experiencing very big shortages. They don't like the idea of a city running out of water. It's an unattractive kind of outcome. They'll pay money to avoid that bad outcome. They're not just risk neutral, they're not interested in maximising expected returns, they're interested in preventing very bad things from happening. A city running out of water, or a city running out of electricity, and they might be prepared to pay a premium to avoid that. That doesn't suggest conservatism, it suggests bringing things forwards so that you don't create bad situations where you have, say, acute shortages of water or electricity. You might think about insurance motives. These projects are taken to provide a form of insurance. They insure against very bad things happening. You build a desal plant not because it yields a good return, but it prevents a disaster happening. It prevents a city running out of water. For many decision makers, that's a very significant risk. So, in short, people might be averse to risk. They might be risk averse, and if they're risk averse, this quasi-option value won't be positive, it might be negative. In fact, you want to bring things forward to prevent disasters occurring that involve you in very significant costs. Now, in fact, you might proceed with these projects if benefits are less than costs. They're less than costs by the amount of the insurance that you're prepared to pay to prevent a disastrous situation from developing. So, this is completely opposed to the real options way of thinking about things. It says policymakers might be prepared to pay an insurance premium by way of a project to prevent some really desperate situation from eventuating. So now you don't even have the qualitative conclusions. You've got a mess, because the real options thing is saying be conservative, postpone these projects, delay them as much as possible. The risk-averse viewpoint says bring them forward. We want to prevent these nasty situations from happening. So you get a kind of tug of war between these two viewpoints. One's dragging you in one direction, one's dragging you in the other direction, and you're not really sure what to do. You can't even make qualitative conclusions. The real options approach says be cautious. The insurance approach says do things early on to prevent disasters from developing. So one of the things we've tried to do is to work out how risk-averse decision makers are. And you can parameterise risk aversion, you can measure the risk aversion of decision makers. It's pretty hard. If you go to a politician and say to them, how risk averse are you? They won't know what language you're talking. Okay? But you can do other things that can elicit information about risk aversion. Maximum regret, this is the same as the situation where a large plant fails, as the situation where both a large and a small plant fail. In fact, the justification for building a large plant using that table is the following. Justifying building a large plant requires the losses from unaddressed severe climate change be large relative to the extra costs implied and the losses inflicted by building a small plant when climate change is severe. You might say that's a mouthful, and there are a lot of things in that mouthful, but in fact there are only 4 data items that I've got to estimate there. Only 4 things that I've got to estimate. There are no probabilities involved. It's a very simple procedure. Okay, it's not as sophisticated as real option analysis, but it's certainly there. They're numbers that I can guess at or get a good feel for. It's certainly much easier to implement that kind of procedure than a real option study. The advantages of the rule: it's simple, it's intuitive. It focuses attention of knowledgeable, experienced managers, people who are actually working in industry on things they can relate to. What are the extra costs of building a large plant? What are the losses I can expect to incur if I build a small plant when I really needed a large plant? These are kind of things that, there are only a few of them, 4 items, and they're things that a good planner should be able to get a feel for. And the thing I like most, because I'm an economist, is it doesn't ask economists or water or electricity planners to do the impossible. So often I'm asked to do the impossible. I was asked to, for example, estimate the stream flow in all the rivers in northeastern Victoria and come up with good climate change adaptation policies. And I was told to do this in 3 months. I said, I'll give you my answer now, because in 3 months I won't have a better answer to give you than I can give you now. I haven't got the faintest idea. That's the answer. I haven't got the faintest idea. I can spend 3 months studying the problem and it won't give me a better understanding, because I know that the climate change forecasts for Australia on very broad basis, I'm not going to be able to provide good estimates. So I had to think very hard, because I was being paid to do the consultancy, but that's what I said to them. I'll give you the answer right now, because in 3 months' time I won't be able to give you a better answer. So this procedure is nice in the sense that it makes modest demands on decision makers. It helps people to focus on things that are important and about which they can reasonably devote their concerns. It doesn't avoid the prospect of disasters. Disasters can still occur. This procedure doesn't avoid disasters. You can still do things that, such as the desal plant. You can build a desal plant, it turns out to be a total failure. You make the wrong kind of investment decision. But what it does do is focus attention on those disasters, on the things that are bad and that might make a project unattractive. It doesn't provide a simple kind of case for action or inaction. It doesn't say you should always do things or you shouldn't do things. It's a bit more nuanced than that. It doesn't prevent disasters from occurring, but it doesn't give you a simple kind of conclusion either. It gives you a conclusion that reflects a fair bit of the information about the problem. So these are my final remarks. I've been working on these heuristics, I've been working on these real option approaches for about 20 years, but I'm increasingly attracted to these heuristics because they're simpler, they're less demanding in situations where you don't have good data. They resolve this problem that when you use real option analysis and you think about insurance motives, you're being dragged in two directions. You don't know which way to react to the problem. You're not sure whether to be conservative or to bring things forward. It does away with the assumption that you've got subjective probability information on future states of the world, on future climate states of the world. I don't think we do have that kind of good probability information. People assign probabilities to this problem. It's a pure guesswork. It's not based on any kind of scientific understanding at all of the problem. If you can't make those probability estimates, my suggestion is don't try to do it. Don't just say, well, I'm going to take a guess. And finally, it doesn't involve using invented data. It's replaced by a procedure that focuses on a few key cost things. What are the costs of different project scales, and what are the losses that you can expect to occur when you build projects of different scales? You're not making impossible demands on planners. It's something that people with a bit of experience in the water industry or the electricity industry, hopefully they can give you information about these sorts of things. Thank you.